Luke Hartwell had ridden fence line for 20 years, but he'd never seen anything like this. The morning was bitter cold. The kind that made breath freeze in the air and turned Wyoming prairie into endless white. His horse picked its way along the northwestern boundary of his ranch, hooves crunching through snow crust. Luke's mind was on ordinary things, cattle counts, hay stores, the calving season coming in March. The sky hung low and gray, promising more snow by nightfall. Then he saw her, a small dark figure in the valley cemetery. Struggling with something, Luke reined in his horse, squinting against the glare of sun on snow, even from a quarter-mile away. He could see the futility of what she was attempting. The ground had been frozen solid for 6 weeks. Nothing short of dynamite would break it now. He urged his horse forward, recognition dawning as he drew closer. Evelyn Hale, the widow who'd settled a hard-scrabble claim 2 miles east last autumn. He'd seen her in town once or twice, always alone, always with that look of fierce determination that came from having no choice but to be strong. She didn't hear him approach. The wind carried sound away across the empty prairie. Luke dismounted slowly, leading his horse the last 30 yards. That's when he saw the small pine coffin resting in the snow beside her. His chest tightened. Evelyn swung the shovel again, putting her whole body into it. The frozen earth yielded nothing. The blade rang against ground hard as stone, sending shockwaves up the handle that he could see jar her shoulders. She staggered, caught herself, raised the shovel again. "Ma'am," Luke said quietly. She spun around, shovel raised like a weapon. Her face was gray with exhaustion and cold. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She'd been crying, but her tears had frozen on her cheeks. "I don't need help," she said. Her voice was hoarse, breaking. Luke looked at the tiny coffin, at the impossible earth, at her trembling hands. He stepped forward and gently took the shovel from her grip. "Let me," he said. She didn't fight. Her hands fell to her sides. Luke positioned himself and drove the shovel down with all his strength. The ground resisted, then gave slightly. He worked the blade, loosening a chunk of frozen dirt. It was going to take hours. He set his jaw and kept digging. Evelyn sank to her knees beside the coffin, one hand resting on its rough pine surface. She didn't speak. Luke didn't ask questions. The only sounds were his shovel striking earth, his breathing growing heavier with effort, and the wind moving through the bare branches of a cottonwood tree at the cemetery's edge. An hour passed. Luke's shoulders burned. Sweat froze on his neck despite the cold. He'd cleared maybe 18 inches of depth. The sound of approaching horses made him look up. Miguel and old Thomas, 2 of his hired hands, rode into the cemetery. They took in the scene with one glance, Luke digging. The woman kneeling. The small coffin. Miguel dismounted without a word. He walked to his saddle, pulled out a pickaxe he'd brought for fence work. Old Thomas joined him. Together they began working alongside Luke, taking turns with shovel and pick. 3 men digging a grave for a child they'd never known. One woman keeping vigil beside a daughter she'd never see grow up. The hole deepened slowly. 2 feet. 3 feet deep enough. Miguel stepped back first, removing his hat. Old Thomas and Luke did the same. The grave was ready. Evelyn stood on legs that trembled. She bent and lifted the small coffin. It was so light. That was the cruelty of it. Clara had weighed almost nothing, even alive, in death. She was lighter still. Luke moved to help, but Evelyn shook her head. She needed to do this part herself. She knelt at the grave's edge and lowered the coffin with shaking arms. The pine box settled on frozen earth with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for something so final. Evelyn stayed kneeling, staring down. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Luke had seen grief before. He'd lost his younger sister to scarlet fever when he was 12. He'd watched his father bury her, watched his mother stop speaking for 3 months afterward. He'd stood at graves of friends, neighbors, hired men killed in accidents. But this, a mother burying her only child alone in January snow, this was different. He reached into his coat and pulled out the worn Bible he always carried. His hands were stiff with cold as he opened to the passage he wanted. The pages were familiar, creased from use. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you'd permit me." Evelyn looked up at him with empty eyes. She nodded once. Luke's voice was steady as he read. "He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm, and carry them in his bosom." The words from Isaiah felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He continued, reading verses about children in heaven, about God's tender mercies and comfort for those who mourn. His voice was the only sound besides the wind. Miguel and old Thomas stood with heads bowed. Evelyn's shoulders began to shake. Then the sobs came. Wrenching sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deep. Luke kept reading. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." When he finished, he closed the Bible carefully. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow. Luke nodded to his men. Together they began filling the grave, working gently, respectfully. Miguel found 2 sturdy pine branches and lashed them together with leather cord from his saddle, forming a simple cross. The mound of earth grew. Luke patted it smooth with the back of the shovel. Miguel placed the cross at its head, driving it deep enough to withstand the wind. "She'll need a proper stone come spring," old Thomas said quietly to Luke. "I can carve one." "That'd be good," Luke replied. Evelyn hadn't moved. She stood beside the grave, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fresh-turned earth. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. Temperature would plummet once darkness fell. Luke glanced at his men. They understood. "We'll head back to the ranch," Miguel said. He touched his hat brim toward Evelyn. "Ma'am, you have our sympathies." Old Thomas nodded his agreement. They mounted and rode off, leaving Luke alone with the widow. "Where's your place?" Luke asked. 2 miles east," Evelyn said. Her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I'll follow you home. Make sure you get there safe." She turned to look at him. For a moment he thought she'd refuse. Then she just nodded and walked to her horse, tied to the cemetery fence. She mounted stiffly, moving like someone much older than her years. Luke swung onto his own horse and followed as she rode out of the cemetery. He kept his distance, not crowding her. The sun set behind them, painting the snow orange and pink. Evelyn rode with her back straight, but Luke could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Her cabin came into view, a small structure tucked against a hillside for wind protection. Smoke rose from the chimney. She must have left a fire burning before she came to the cemetery. Evelyn dismounted and went inside without looking back. A moment later, lamplight appeared in the window. Luke waited until he was certain she was safe. Then he turned his horse toward home, inside the cabin. Evelyn sat at her table without removing her coat. Her hands lay flat on the rough wood. She couldn't feel them. Couldn't feel anything. 3 days ago, Clara had been alive. Feverish, but alive. Evelyn had ridden 8 miles through darkness to fetch Dr. Morrison from town. Her infant daughter wrapped in blankets and burning hot against her chest. The doctor had followed her back. But by the time they arrived, Clara's breathing had changed. By dawn, she was gone. The doctor had been kind. He'd helped Evelyn wash Clara's tiny body, had wrapped her in clean linen. Then he'd left, promising to send word to neighbors. But no one had come. It was January, the hardest month. Everyone was dealing with their own struggles, their own stock to feed, their own challenges with this brutal winter. Evelyn had understood. She'd always understood. When her husband Daniel died under a fallen timber 14 months ago, neighbors had helped at first. They'd brought food, offered assistance, but frontier kindness had limits. People had their own lives, their own troubles. Eventually, everyone drifted back to their own concerns. She'd learned to manage alone, taught herself to handle Daniel's work feeding cattle, mending fence, hauling water from the creek. She'd been proud of her independence. When she discovered she was carrying Daniel's child, she'd been terrified and grateful both. A piece of him, still alive. Clara had been born in May, delivered by a midwife from the neighboring claim. The woman had stayed 2 days, then left, Evelyn and Clara, alone together. It had been enough, more than enough, until 3 nights ago. Evelyn had built the coffin herself yesterday. She'd measured it carefully, using pine boards Daniel had saved for building a crib. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd lined it with fabric from her wedding dress white linen, carefully cut and sewn. Clara deserved something beautiful. This morning, she'd loaded the coffin onto her wagon and driven to the cemetery. She'd unloaded it herself. She'd picked up the shovel with grim determination, fully intending to dig the grave alone. But the ground had defeated her. After 2 hours of futile effort, her arms shaking, her hands blistered, she'd made almost no progress. The earth was simply too frozen. Then he'd appeared. The rancher. Luke Hartwell, she knew his name from town. He ran one of the larger spreads in the territory, had a reputation for fair dealing and quiet competence. He'd taken the shovel without hesitation, hadn't asked questions or offered empty platitudes, just dug. When his men arrived, they dug too. 3 strangers working in the cold to help her bury her daughter. The kindness of it broke something in her. All the fierce independence she'd cultivated, all the walls she'd built to survive alone, they crumbled in the face of simple human compassion. Evelyn finally moved, pulling off her coat. Her hands were numb. Her feet, too. She added wood to the stove and stood close to it, trying to thaw. But the cold she felt wasn't the kind that heat could touch. Tomorrow she'd wake up and Clara would still be gone. The day after that. The same. And the day after that. An endless succession of days without her daughter. She thought about the rancher reading from his Bible, the steadiness of his voice, the way he'd stayed until the grave was filled and marked, the way he'd followed her home to make sure she arrived safely. Maybe surviving alone wasn't the same as living. Maybe there was another way. But tonight, she was too tired to think about it. Tonight, she could only sit by the stove and let the tears come. Luke returned the next morning as promised. He brought a wagon load of split firewood and a sack of supplies from his ranch stores. Evelyn heard the wagon approaching and stepped outside. The day was bright, sun glinting off fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Everything looked clean and new, which felt wrong somehow. "Morning," Luke said, touching his hat brim. "Brought firewood. Thought you might be running low. I have enough." Evelyn said, it was automatic, the response she'd trained herself to give. "Then you'll have more." Luke replied. He began unloading without waiting for permission. Evelyn watched for a moment, then moved to help. He didn't stop her. They worked in silence, stacking wood against the cabin wall. When the wagon was empty, Luke walked to her barn. "Your door's hanging crooked," he observed. "Hinge broke. Yes, I've been meaning to fix it. I'll do it now if you've got spare hardware." She showed him where Daniel's tools were kept. Luke worked efficiently, removing the broken hinge and replacing it with one from Daniel's collection. The door swung smoothly when he finished. "Thank you," Evelyn said. The words felt small. "Coffee, if you have it," Luke asked. She nodded and led him to the cabin. Inside, she poured coffee from the pot on the stove. They sat at her table, the same table where she'd sat alone last night. "Your cattle look thin," Luke said. "You got enough hay?" "Enough to get through. I'll bring some extra." "No charge, I've got surplus this year." Evelyn wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it. But pride wouldn't feed her cattle. "That's generous," she said instead. They drank coffee in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. Luke seemed content to sit quietly, and Evelyn found she didn't mind the company. "The baby," Luke said finally. Clara. Evelyn nodded, throat tight. My sister died when she was 7. Luke said, Sarah. Scarlet fever took her in 3 days. I remember my pa digging her grave. Remember thinking the ground shouldn't be so hard when someone so soft was going in it. I'm sorry, Evelyn whispered. Long time ago, but you don't forget. Luke finished his coffee. I'll be back in a few days. Check on things. You don't have to. I know, he said. But I will. He left with the same quiet efficiency he'd arrived with. Evelyn stood at her window, watching his wagon disappear over the ridge. 3 days later, he returned. He brought hay this time, helped her distribute it to her small herd. The next week, he brought lamp oil and coffee. The week after that, he repaired a section of fence damaged by wind. A pattern emerged. Every few days, Luke would arrive with some practical purpose fence to mend, wood to split, supplies to deliver. He never came empty-handed, never stayed too long. They'd share coffee, exchange a few words, fall into comfortable silence. Evelyn found herself watching for him on the days he didn't come. The cabin felt emptier on the days he did. Something in her chest loosened slightly. One afternoon in late January, Luke noticed her fiddle hanging on the wall. You play? He asked. Used to. Before. Play something now. She hesitated, then took down the fiddle. Her fingers were stiff at first, but memory guided them. She played a simple folk tune, something her mother had taught her. The notes filled the cabin, chasing away silence. When she finished, Luke was smiling slightly. That was fine, he said. Real fine. Do you play anything? Can't carry a tune in a bucket, but I like listening. She played another song, then another. Luke sat at her table, drinking coffee, listening, for the first time since Clara died. Evelyn felt something other than grief. Not happiness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it, somewhere down the line. When Luke left that evening, Evelyn realized she'd smiled, just briefly, but it had happened. The ice was beginning to thaw. February arrived with deceptive calm. The sky stayed clear for days, and temperatures rose enough that snow began melting in the afternoon sun, freezing again at night into treacherous sheets of ice. Luke's visits had become routine. Evelyn expected him every 3 or 4 days. She'd started timing her chores so she'd be near the cabin when he usually arrived. She told herself it was practical if he was helping with heavy work. She should be available, but she knew it was more than that. They talked more now. Small revelations, carefully offered. Luke told her about his ranch, about the horses he bred for mountain work. Strong stock that could handle Wyoming winters and steep terrain. It's what my pa started, he said one afternoon. They were mending harness in her barn, hands working leather while they talked. He had this idea that you could breed for cold tolerance, sure feet, steady temperament altogether. Most folks thought he was crazy. Was he? Little bit. But he was right too. Took 20 years, but we've got horses now that other ranchers come asking for. Evelyn found herself telling him about her life before Daniel died. How she'd grown up in Missouri, daughter of a schoolteacher. How she'd loved reading poetry, especially Whitman. Never read much poetry, Luke admitted. Don't have the schooling for it. Schooling doesn't matter. It's about feeling, not understanding. Read me some. She fetched her worn copy of Leaves of Grass and read aloud while they worked. Luke listened, hands stilling on the leather. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Read that part again, he said. About the grass. She did. His face was thoughtful. That's about death being part of life. Isn't it? He asked. I think so. About how nothing's really lost, just changed. I like that, Luke said. It's a comfort. They worked in silence after that, but it was a companionable silence. Evelyn realized she'd told him things she hadn't spoken aloud since Daniel died. Luke had a way of listening that made words come easier. The next time he visited, she had fresh bread waiting. She'd baked it that morning, telling herself it was just practical, she needed bread anyway. But she'd used the last of her good flour and added honey she'd been saving. Luke noticed. "This is fine bread," he said. "Best I've had in months." "The men at your ranch don't bake. They try. Results are mixed." He grinned. "Miguel makes tortillas that could stop bullets. Thomas burns everything. Mostly we eat simple." Evelyn laughed. It surprised her. The sound of her own laughter. She'd forgotten what it felt like. "I could teach them," she offered. "If you wanted. They'd probably appreciate that. I know I would." The conversation shifted to easier topics: weather, cattle, the coming spring. But underneath ran a current of something else, something neither of them named but both felt when Luke left that evening. He paused at his wagon. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "I'm glad I rode past that cemetery back in January." "So am I," she said quietly. He nodded and drove away. Evelyn stood in her doorway longer than necessary, watching until his wagon disappeared. That night, lying in bed, she let herself think about possibilities, about what it might mean that a good man had started visiting regularly, about whether her heart could risk opening again. Clara's absence still ached, but Luke's presence had become something she looked forward to. The two truths existed together, grief and hope, side by side. Maybe that was how healing worked, not forgetting, but making room for something new alongside what was lost. The blizzard hit on February 15th. Luke saw it coming, a dark wall of clouds building in the northwest. The particular quality of light that meant heavy snow and high winds. He'd planned to check on Evelyn that afternoon anyway. The approaching storm made it urgent. He rode fast, pushing his horse harder than usual. The wind was already picking up, temperature dropping. By the time he reached Evelyn's place, the first flakes were falling. She was outside, struggling to drive her small herd of cattle toward the barn. The animals were spooked by the wind, scattering instead of gathering. Luke dismounted and moved to help without speaking. Together they worked, moving methodically, pushing the cattle into the barn. Snow was falling thick now, visibility dropping. The wind howled across the prairie, driving snow horizontal. They got the last cow inside just as the full force of the storm hit. Luke latched the barn door while Evelyn distributed hay. His horse whinnied nervously. "Bring him inside," Evelyn shouted over the wind. "There's room." Luke led his horse into the barn, unsaddled him, gave him feed and water. Through the barn walls, the wind screamed. Snow was already piling against the door. "Can't ride home in this," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "No." "I'll wait it out in the barn." "Don't be foolish. Come to the cabin." They ran from barn to cabin, bent against wind that tried to knock them over. Snow stung their faces, got in their eyes and mouths. Evelyn's door was only 30 yards from the barn, but they were both gasping when they got inside. Luke secured the door while Evelyn built up the fire. The cabin was small, one room with a loft. Luke saw her bed in the corner, Clara's empty cradle beside it. A wave of awareness hit him. They'd be alone together, possibly for days. "I can sleep by the fire," he said. "Won't be the first time." "There are blankets in the chest," Evelyn replied. She was being practical, treating this like any other situation requiring hospitality. But it wasn't any other situation, and they both knew it. The storm raged all day and through the night. Wind shook the cabin. Snow piled against the walls until they couldn't see out the window. Luke and Evelyn moved around each other carefully, maintaining polite distance in the small space. The second day was worse. The storm intensified. They were truly trapped now, surrounded by snow that had drifted higher than the windows. The world had shrunk to this one room. They played cards, read from Evelyn's books. Luke whittled while Evelyn mended clothes. They talked about safe things, weather, ranching, books. But that night, the careful distance broke. Evelyn woke crying. Luke heard it from his bedroll by the fire, harsh sobs that shook her whole body. He lay still, uncertain. But the sobs continued, growing worse. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Her voice was muffled. Luke stood and moved to her bedside. In the dim firelight, he could see her sitting up, arms wrapped around herself. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me about her." And she did. Everything poured out: Clara's birth, the joy of it, the fear of raising a child alone, how Clara had started smiling at 2 months, how she'd reached for Evelyn's hair and grabbed it tight, the sound of her laugh, the weight of her in Evelyn's arms, the fever that came so sudden and burned so hot, the desperate ride for the doctor, the terrible moment when Clara's breathing changed. Luke sat on the floor beside her bed and listened. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just listened. When her words ran out, he shared his own grief. His sister Sarah, 7 years old and full of life until scarlet fever took her in 3 days. His father, who never recovered, who worked himself into an early grave because grief was too heavy to carry. His mother, who grew silent and distant. "I learned young that loss changes you," Luke said, "but it doesn't have to destroy you." Does it get easier? It gets different. You make room for it. Learn to carry it. They talked until dawn, the storm still raging outside. In the darkness and isolation, defenses fell away. They were just two people who'd known loss, finding comfort in shared understanding. The third day, the storm began to break. Wind died down. Snow stopped falling. They could see sky again. Luke prepared to leave. He saddled his horse in the barn while Evelyn made coffee for the journey. When he came to the cabin for it, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. "Thank you," Evelyn said, "for listening. Thank you for letting me stay." Their eyes met. Luke took a step toward her, then stopped. Whatever was building between them deserved time, deserved to develop naturally. Rushing it would dishonor what they'd shared. "I'll be back when the road's clear," he said. Evelyn nodded. Luke rode away without looking back. But he felt her watching from the window. That night, alone in his own cabin. Luke admitted the truth to himself. He loved her, not from pity or obligation, but from genuine affection and respect. The question was what to do about it. Luke rode into town the first week of March, needing supplies and dreading the visit in equal measure. Winter had kept most folks isolated, but the warming weather brought people out. Main Street was busy. He tied his horse outside the general store and went in. The store was crowded. Conversation stopped when he entered, then resumed with telling glances in his direction. Luke gathered what he needed: coffee, flour, lamp oil. At the counter, Mrs. Agnes Thornton stood gossiping with the shopkeeper's wife. Visiting that widow awful regular. Mrs. Thornton was saying, 3 times a week, I heard, well, she's alone out there. The shopkeeper's wife replied, alone is one thing, but a man and a woman. Unchaperoned. Mrs. Thornton caught sight of Luke and had the grace to flush slightly, but she didn't stop. Mr. Hartwell, we were just discussing your charity work. The way she said charity made it sound like something shameful. Just being neighborly, Luke said evenly. Of course, though some might wonder at the propriety. A widower visiting a widow so often, people do talk. Luke paid for his supplies without responding, but the words followed him out of the store, on the street. He caught more whispers, more speculative looks. He rode home troubled. Not by the gossip itself, he'd lived long enough to know people talked, but by what it made him question. Why had he started visiting Evelyn? Was it truly neighborly concern? Or had he seen a vulnerability he could exploit? Did he love her? Or did he just need to be needed? The questions gnawed at him. That night, lying awake, Luke forced himself to examine his motives honestly. He'd been drawn to her from that first moment in the cemetery. Yes. But was it love or pity? He stayed away. 1 week became 2. He told himself he needed clarity, needed to be certain his feelings were genuine before proceeding. But staying away brought its own clarity. He missed her. Missed their conversations, her laugh, the way she read poetry. Missed the feeling that came from being with someone who understood loss without needing it explained. Still, he stayed away. If he couldn't be certain of his heart, he had no right to involve her. The decision was taken from him on a gray morning when Evelyn rode into his ranch yard. She sat her horse with the same fierce determination he'd seen that January day in the cemetery. "My milk cow's sick," she said without preamble. "Needs doctoring. I came to ask if you'd look at her." Luke wiped his hands on his trousers, suddenly nervous. "Of course. Let me get my kit." They rode to her place in silence. The cow was indeed sick, bloated stomach. Signs of grain found her. Luke treated her while Evelyn watched. "She'll recover," he said finally. "Keep her off feed for a day, then start slow." "Thank you." Evelyn paid him with the coins that were meant for next month's supplies. Luke started to refuse, then saw the pride in her face and accepted. They stood in her barn, the sick cow between them. Everything that needed saying hanging unspoken in the air. "Why'd you stop coming?" Evelyn asked. Luke met her eyes. "Town talk made me question my motives." "And what did you decide?" "That I needed to be certain. Certain I wasn't helping because it made me feel needed. Certain I wasn't taking advantage of my grief." Evelyn's voice was sharp. "My vulnerability." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but cold. "I've survived my husband's death. I've survived my daughter's death. I've survived this winter alone. I don't need your charity. Mr. Hartwell, if you come back, it must be because you want to, not because you feel obliged, not because helping me soothes your conscience. If you can't be certain of that, then don't come back at all." She walked out of the barn. Luke stood there, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. She was right, and more, she deserved better than his doubt. He found her at the cabin door. "You're right," he said. "You deserve certainty. I need time to be sure I can give you that." Evelyn nodded once, her face carefully blank. "Then take your time." Luke rode away knowing he'd hurt her, knowing she'd wrapped her armor back around herself, but knowing too that she'd told him the truth if he came back. It had to be for the right reasons. Back at his ranch, Luke spent days in hard physical labor, working until exhaustion made thought impossible. But the questions followed him. Did he love Evelyn? Yes. Was it real love, grounded in respect and admiration, or was it something else, something less worthy? The answer came on a bright morning when he found himself planning to tell her about the new foal born overnight. Found himself wanting to hear what she'd think about the fence repair at the north pasture. Found himself missing not just her presence, but specifically her thoughts, her voice, her particular way of seeing the world. He loved her. Not perfectly, not without questions, but genuinely. And she deserved to know. April came with warmth and mud and the smell of thawing earth. Luke saddled his best horse and rode toward Evelyn's claim with his heart hammering against his ribs. The prairie was transforming. Brown grass showed through melting snow. The first brave shoots of green pushed up where south-facing slopes caught sun. Overhead, geese flew north in ragged V formations, calling to each other. Evelyn's cabin came into view. She was outside, working the garden plot beside her house. She'd cleared away winter debris and was turning earth with a spade, preparing for planting. Luke dismounted and tied his horse to the fence. Evelyn straightened when she saw him, one hand shading her eyes against the sun. She didn't smile, but she didn't send him away either. "Morning," Luke said. "Morning." He walked to the garden's edge, The earth was still cold but no longer frozen. Workable. The sight of it moved him. This same ground that had defeated them both in January was now yielding to her. Spade. I've been thinking. Luke said, about what you said. About certainty. Evelyn drove her spade into the earth and left it standing. She faced him fully, waiting. I love you, Luke said. The words came out plain and direct. Not from pity. Not from obligation. I love your strength and your stubbornness. I love how you read poetry and play fiddle. I love that you built a coffin for your daughter with your own hands because you wanted her to have something beautiful. I love how you don't need rescuing, but you're brave enough to accept help anyway. He took a breath. I know it hasn't been long since Clara died. I know you're still grieving. I'm not asking you to stop grieving or to rush into anything, but I wanted you to know my heart, and to ask if when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you'd consider becoming my wife. The silence stretched. A meadowlark called from somewhere nearby. The wind moved through grass just beginning to green. Why now? Evelyn asked finally. Because spring's coming. Because life keeps moving forward whether we're ready or not. Because I'd rather tell you the truth and risk losing you than stay quiet and definitely lose you. Evelyn looked down at her garden plot, at the dark earth waiting for seeds. When she looked back up, her eyes were wet. I need to show you something, she said. She led him to the cemetery. They walked in silence, following the path that had become too familiar to both of them. The valley cemetery looked different in April winter-brown grass giving way to green, the cottonwood tree showing the first hint of leaf buds. Clara's grave had settled some over the winter. The wooden cross stood straight, weathered but solid. New grass was beginning to grow over the mound. Evelyn knelt beside it. Luke stood back, giving her space. Clara, Evelyn said softly. This is Luke, the man I told you about, the man who helped me when I couldn't help myself. Her voice broke slightly. I need to tell you something. Sweet girl, I'm going to keep living, really living, not just surviving. And that means letting myself love someone again. She was quiet for a moment, one hand on the grass covering her daughter. I think you'd have liked him, she whispered. She stood and turned to Luke. Tears tracked down her face, but she was smiling. Yes, she said. When I'm ready, yes. Luke closed the distance between them and took her hands. They were work-roughened, strong, capable hands. Hands that had built a coffin and planted seeds and learned to survive alone. There's no rush, he said. We'll take whatever time you need. I know. She squeezed his hands. That's why I said yes. They stood together beside Clara's grave. Two people scarred by loss, choosing to risk love anyway. The spring sun warmed their faces, around them. The world was turning green. They married in May, when the prairie was fully green and wildflowers dotted the hillsides. It was a small ceremony at Luke's ranch. Miguel and old Thomas stood as witnesses. A circuit preacher happened through and performed the service on a Sunday afternoon. 3 neighboring families came, and Mrs. Thornton attended with pursed lips and grudging congratulations. Evelyn wore a dress she'd sewn herself from blue calico. She'd left off mourning black, but the dress was simple, practical. She carried wildflowers she'd picked that morning, prairie roses and blue flax. Luke wore his Sunday best and couldn't stop smiling. The vows were traditional. Love, honor, cherish. In sickness and health till death. The words felt weighty and true. When Luke slipped the ring on Evelyn's finger, his mother's ring, saved for years, his hand shook slightly. I now pronounce you man and wife. The preacher said. Luke kissed his wife. Evelyn's hands rested on his shoulders. The small gathering applauded. There was cake and coffee afterward. Miguel had attempted baking and produced something edible if dense. Evelyn laughed when she tried it, promised to teach him properly. The neighbors left as evening came on, wishing them well. That night, Evelyn stood in Luke's cabin, their cabin now, looking at the home she'd share. It was larger than hers, better built. There was room for her books, her fiddle, room for a life. "We can bring your things tomorrow," Luke said. "Whatever you want from your place. I'd like to keep my claim." Evelyn said, "If that's all right, maybe use it for summer pasture, or it's yours to keep." Luke interrupted gently. "I'm not asking you to give up your independence." She smiled at that. "I know. It's one reason I married you. The next weeks were an adjustment, learning to share space, learning each other's habits and rhythms." Luke rose before dawn. Evelyn liked to read late into the night. He was methodical and patient. She was quick and intuitive. But they complemented each other, filled in each other's gaps. Evelyn taught Miguel and old Thomas to bake bread. She organized Luke's chaotic record-keeping. She brought music into the ranch house fiddle in the evenings, sometimes her voice singing old ballads. Luke gave her space for her grief. Some mornings he'd wake and find her already gone, knowing she'd ridden to the cemetery. He never followed, never asked. When she came back, he'd have coffee waiting. One morning in late May, Evelyn suggested they visit Clara's grave together. They rode out in the golden morning light. Spring was in full bloom now. The cemetery was carpeted with wildflowers. Clara's grave had greened over completely, peaceful and settled. Evelyn had brought flower seeds, blue flax, the same she'd carried at her wedding. She knelt and planted them around the grave marker, while Luke mended the cemetery fence nearby. They worked in companionable silence. The meadowlarks sang. Wind moved through new grass. The world was alive with growing things. Old Thomas finished the stone. Luke said, "Want to see it?" He brought it from his saddlebag, a flat piece of granite, carefully carved. Clara Rose Hale, born May 3, 1885, died January 10, 1886, beloved daughter. "It's beautiful," Evelyn whispered. Together they set it in place, replacing the wooden cross. The stone would last, would mark this place where her daughter rested. When they finished, they stood together looking at it. Luke's arm was around Evelyn's shoulders. Her hand rested on his chest. "She'll always be part of us," Evelyn said. "Part of our story." "Always," Luke agreed. They rode home slowly, savoring the warm afternoon. The cemetery disappeared behind them, but it would always be there, a place to remember, to grieve, to honor what was lost. But ahead lay their ranch, their home, their life together. Ahead lay possibility and hope and the everyday work of building something lasting. That evening, Evelyn played her fiddle on the porch while Luke mended tack. The music drifted across the prairie, joyful and haunting both. Life and loss, woven together. Grief and hope, learning to coexist. Luke looked at his wife in the golden light. Her eyes closed as she played, and felt gratitude wash over him. For the frozen January morning that had brought him to a cemetery, for the courage to stay when staying was hard, for the grace of second chances. Evelyn finished playing and opened her eyes, found Luke watching her. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking how lucky I am." "We both are," she said. She was right. They'd both known terrible loss. But they'd also found something rare, a love forged in the hardest season, tested by grief and doubt, strong enough to last. The sun set over the prairie, painting everything gold and rose. Inside, the lamps were lit, the home was warm, and two people who'd once been alone had found their way to belonging. Spring had come, and with it, the promise that life, however hard, continues. That love, however scarred, endures. That hope, however fragile, is worth choosing again and again.